On Tuesday after school, Locke went looking for his father's tool chest. He could see it clearly in his mind, made of old metal, painted green, lots of little compartments. He'd seen Dad doing repairs around the old place often enough. It was still a little hard for him to grasp that Dad was gone, and that place wasn't home anymore. Mrs. Thalberg let him in without any problems, but when he told Gary what he needed, he got a look of suspicion. "What do you need a hammer for?" "I just need it for a few minutes," said Locke, knowing even as he said it that this wasn't really an answer. "It has to be a claw hammer, the kind you can use to pull nails out of wood with." "Yeah, but... okay, on one condition." "Yeah?" "I want to come with you. I want to see what's up." Locke thought about this. Gary might not be the coolest guy around, but he seemed to be pretty smart. That might come in handy. "Sure," he said. So, a few minutes later, Gary was looking over the panel. Locke had told him about Hans having the closet locked and about the weird noise behind the panel. It was strange how totally unscary everything looked by daylight. "That guy must have been planning all along to get back in here," said Gary. "See, the nail heads aren't flush with the wood, they stick out a little bit, so you can get the claw under them. A little more hammering and they'd have gone all the way and it'd be a whole lot harder to get them out. As it is, it should be pretty easy." When Locke put the claw of the hammer on one of the nails, it came halfway out at the first tug. "Looks like you're right," he said. One by one, the nails came out. Locke lifted the panel off the floor, looked down, and stared in disbelief. He was looking down into another room, but not one on the first floor of this house. Almost all he could see of it was the floor, but that was a whole world of weird by itself. It was made of timbers that looked ancient and half-rotten, and there were mushrooms and lichens growing out of it. Stranger still, it wasn't flat. It was V-shaped at such a deep angle that it would be very hard to walk on it. Strangest of all was that Locke could see, now, what had been making the scraping sound. It was a tree branch, the tip of what looked like a healthy red maple branch. It was coming from somewhere off to the side, in the direction the light was coming from. Also, there seemed to be ivy growing on the ceiling. Locke could see it around the edges. For a moment, for a very long moment, Locke and Gary just sat there staring. Then Locke touched the branch. It was still real. It felt perfectly normal. It was just where it was that was wrong. And the air coming out of the hole was warm and damp and smelled very fresh. Locke guessed that this room was open to the outside, that the tree branch had grown in from there, and that it had been the wind brushing it back and forth on the wooden panel that had made that sound. But how was any of this possible? Locke picked up a nail and dropped it into the hole, and here he got the biggest surprise of all. Instead of falling all the way down, landing on that strange floor and rolling into the center, it fell only a couple of feet, then slowed to a stop, hung in mid-air for a split second, then flew up again. It actually went back up into the closet, rising a few feet into the air, then dropping through again, then rising again, like a yo-yo but without a string. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Locke caught the nail and put it down on the floor. It was creepy to see something as basic as gravity not working right. He looked around, half expecting things to start floating away. "I've figured it out," Gary finally said. "You have?" "Yeah, wherever this portal goes to." Locke realized that that was really what this was, a portal to somewhere else. "That's not the floor down there, it's the ceiling. So when the nail drops to the other side of this hole, it's going up, not down, so it starts falling the other way." Gary stuck his hand through the portal and waved it around, a look of concentration on his face. "Yes," he said at last, "that's what's going on. I wonder what's really on the other side of it." He looked at Locke as if waiting for him to volunteer to step through it. "Do I really want to do this?" thought Locke. "What if it suddenly stops working while I'm in the middle of it? Maybe we could put a camera on a stick or something." But somehow he couldn't say these things to Gary. He prepared to put a foot through, but Gary stopped him. "Head first, dude," said Gary. "Otherwise, when you come out the other side, you'll be upside down. Here, I'll show you." Gary took a deep breath and dove into the portal as if it were a swimming pool. Then he scrambled up out of it on the other side. Diving head first anywhere always felt wrong to Locke, like he was just asking for a cracked skull. But he wasn't about to let Gary show him up. He took the plunge. There was a horrible moment of vertigo while his body tried to reorient itself, and then his palms were resting on the floor of the other side. Ivy growing on a thin layer of leaf mold, and pushing up, he got his feet under him, stood up, and looked around. In front of him he could see what looked like a crumbling brick wall with a door in it. Something seemed to be growing on the door. The light, it looked like daylight, was coming from behind him. Turning around, he saw that he was in some kind of abandoned shed. A huge fallen tree had taken out a wall at the end opposite the door, letting in the sun. The floor was covered in ivy as far as the sunlight would reach. Outside the shed, the red maple spread its branches in all directions, including the one that went into the shed and stuck into the hole. The wind he'd heard last night must have blown it back and forth. Locke pushed it aside, solving that problem right there. Rags and curtains of moss hung from the thicker branches. The air was warm and heavy with moisture. Locke stayed like this for a minute or so, just looking and wondering. Then he decided that as long as he'd come this far, he might as well look around some more. The portal had been open since he'd gotten here, and for who knew how long before that. It wasn't going to close up. He climbed over the fallen tree and stepped outside, Gary just behind him. They were in what looked like a jungle. To their left was a wall of shrubs higher than their heads, heavily overgrown with different sorts of vine. To their right were young saplings poking up through a floor of weeds and tall grass. All around them, moss and vines burdened the bigger trees. Wildflowers seemed to jostle each other for space wherever the sunlight got through. Stranger still, everywhere in the jungle were signs that people had once lived here. The shed they had come out of was covered with ivy. What was left of a fence was to their right, not far away. Behind them were a ruined house, and another that seemed to have fallen into its own basement. For several long moments, Locke and Gary just stood there, looking around, trying to make sense of it all. Then Gary spoke. "Locke," he said. "Yeah?" "I'm telling you right now, if a weird little dude with hooves and hairy legs comes by, or any kind of talking animal, I'm out of here." Locke snorted. "Seriously, Gary, where do you think this is?" he said. "Some other planet?" "Maybe," said Gary, "but I doubt it. The gravity feels the same, the air smells the same, no sulfur or ammonia or anything, and even though this place looks like the middle of the Amazon rainforest, when you look at the plants themselves, they look familiar. In fact, you see those vines growing all over what's left of that fence? I'm pretty sure that's honeysuckle. And this tree, you've got one just like it in your backyard." "The bugs look the same, too," said Locke, watching a pill bug crawling down the trunk of the fallen tree. "And the houses, they're in ruins, but they look like they were built for people, not creatures 20 feet tall or 18 inches high or anything like that. That's gotta be a dandelion over there. This is Earth, then. Weird. Wouldn't it be weirder if we were on some other planet?" "Well," said Locke uncertainly, "seems to me, if you find a magic portal in your closet, you expect it to go to another dimension or something. You don't expect it to go to another backyard." "I hadn't thought of it like that." They moved in silence toward the front of the houses, stepping around a porcupine that made no effort to get out of their way, and walking through a cloud of birds picking beetles off a creeper that hung on a pile of rubble. Out in the street, all of the houses were ruined and overgrown. The telephone poles still stood, but the wires had fallen, and the poles had been colonized by nesting birds. The sidewalks, and even the roads, were covered with a thin layer of leaf mold that supported mosses and low-lying vines. The cars and minivans were sad, rusted ruins. "This might be Louisiana," said Locke, looking at the moss hanging off the trees. "One of those places out in the bayou that got hit really bad by Katrina." "I don't know," said Gary. "If you look over there down the street a ways, there's a tree growing right in the middle of what used to be a house, and it's already 20 or 30 feet tall. This place looks like it's been deserted for decades. But some of the cars... Hang on." Gary went to get a closer look at a nearby car, pushing aside some weeds to check the license plate. Then he ran out into the street and looked carefully at the two nearest houses. Finally, he came back. "Locke," he said, "I think I know where we are. The problem is when." "What do you mean?" "Look at this house," said Gary. "There's ivy all over everything and bits of aluminum siding, but it's the same size and shape as your house." Sure enough, it was the right size, and the doors and windows were in the right places. The only strange thing was the siding, which Locke's house didn't have. "And look at the place next door. Most of it's fallen into the basement, but it's got the same L shape as my house, and it's about the right size. That car, or what's left of it in the driveway over there, that's Dad's new Prius. And that building we came out of, wasn't that your shed?" "Yeah, that maple might even be the same one, but grown up. We're standing right in front of your house, but it's the future. Way in the future from the looks of things."